Sweet in the morning, oh Lord, it's sweet in the morning.
I'm Dr. Horace Huntley. This is an interview with Mrs. Ruth Barefield-Pendleton from Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. We're at Miles College, March 9th, 1995. Good afternoon, Mrs. Pendleton.
Good afternoon, Dr. Huntley.
Thank you very much for coming out, taking time out of your busy schedule today to sit and talk with us about the Civil Rights Movement. Before we get into asking questions about the movement itself, I'd like to just get a little background. Where are you an Alabamian originally?
No, I'm not. I come from Pascagoula, Mississippi.
Pascagoula, Mississippi. Oh, okay.
A foreigner to the west.
Well, Pascagoula, that's down on the coast, is that right?
That's right.
Yes.
It's the beginning of the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
Oh, I see. I see. Then, were your parents from Mississippi?
No, my parents come from Monroe County, Alabama, from the community of Chrysler, Alabama, which is no longer in existence. But at an early age, they left and came to Pascagoula when Pascagoula was known as Scranton, Mississippi. And that was back in the very early 1900s.
I see. So,
So they really are Mississippi. Well, my mother is still living at 99 years. My father died 2 years ago at 97. And they were there for 76 years.
So they, in fact, were Mississippians.
We're Mississippians.
That's great. Well, how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters.
Are they still in Mississippi?
No. One brother's in Gadsden, Alabama. Another brother's in Atlanta, Georgia. And a sister's in Mobile, Alabama. And a sister's in Philadelphia, Mississippi.
So you guys are just scattered all over the country.
Scattered all over, not too far though.
Yeah, that's right. So how do you fit in there? Were you the second
I'm the
child?
youngest of the 5.
So you were the spoiled one of the family.
No, the outspoken one.
I see, I see.
The youngest can always get away with more than the others.
Absolutely. Tell me about the education of your parents, your mother and your father.
Well, my father's formal he used to like to say he had his trunk packed for Mr. Washington's school in Tuskegee. But his formal education really stopped at the 7th grade. And his mother died shortly. She didn't want him to go to Tuskegee because she said that she had heard that the white men were killing the coloreds who were trying to get an education. We were colored back then.
Right.
So he took his young bride and he left after his mother died and went to Pascagoula.
I see.
Now, my mother says that her education really began when her children began school. And she still studies, even to this day at 99, when her mail comes, she reads it first.
She reads her own mail. That's
yes,
great.
she does.
Great. What about occupations?
My father, in the young years, was a truck driver for a lumber company, and then he began to work for the post office in janitorial position, and he worked up to become a mail carrier. He picked up mail from substations and drove them to the main post office. My mother was always a housewife.
And this is Mississippi, early 19th century.
This is early
20th century, mid-20th. So.
Now, he did not start working for the post office until I was in high school. But before then, his occupation was a truck driver.
Tell me a little about your community, the community that you grew up in.
Well, Pascagoula is a seaport town. It was really founded by the Jesuit priests. It's a Catholic town. However, we were one of the few Protestant families in the community. And before the shipyard came there, Ingalls Shipyard, all whites and blacks knew each other. But then with the coming of the shipyard, you had a lot of transit, a lot of people coming in. So it has grown to be the third largest city in Mississippi. Jackson, Meridian, then Pascagoula.
What about the racial makeup?
Well, I have not lived there since I left to go to college.
Right, yes.
But the racial climate there seems to be improving. You see, the coastal part of Mississippi was never as rigid in its, the Delta,
Right.
Uh-huh.
The Delta is the black belt area.
The Delta
right.
is the black belt area, and anywhere where blacks outnumber whites, the climate is not good. Well, down on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, it was a little better.
So-
And then the occupation, it was better economically also,
Right.
because of the shipyard,
Right. So the shipyard was really where most people worked.
where most people,
Pascagoula.
and still do. And then, of course, you have a cannery out on Cat Island. You've got, these are businesses that sprang up from the shipyard. You have a fertilizer factory over on another island. And, of course, the fertilizer is made from poge fish.
Interesting.
And, of course, now the industry is gambling,
Right. Absolutely.
down in that area.
Yes. Tell me, after you finish high school, then you go off to college. Where do you go to college?
I went to Tougaloo College, Tougaloo, Mississippi, and this is on the other side of Jackson. And now Jackson suburbs has grown so much that it reaches the suburbs of Tougaloo. Now Tougaloo is just a whistle stop.
Sure.
The only thing there is the campus and a few families that live outside the community.
Right. Well, tell me about how was the transition from Pascagoula to Tougaloo?
Well, it wasn't hard. Tougaloo is a private liberal arts school. It is a sister school to Talladega and to Fisk. It was founded by the American Missionary Association, and of course they came south, set up schools and churches for the children of the new freed black man. Well, when I went to college, the faculty was predominantly white. The president was white. So my association with whites, that was the beginning there at Tougaloo. And of course, when I moved to Alabama, the first thing I did was to look for a congregational church. See, it's a congregational school.
Right.
And there, when I went to the congregational church, I met Reverend Harold Long, who was the pastor there, who was very involved in civil rights issues.
Right. Before we get to Birmingham, let me just ask you about your Mississippi experiences. Prior to going to Tougaloo, you lived in a black community, I assume.
I lived in a black community. The home house is still there. My mother and father ran the household. As a matter of fact, it's the house that I was born in, and the family house is still there.
Is that where your mother still lives?
Yes.
In the home house? That's interesting. Well, when you left and went off to Tougaloo, what had you decided to do with your life?
Well, at that time, where we were black people, women, you either were going to be a teacher or a nurse. I didn't want to be either of those things. Of course, I ended up being a teacher. And my father, who was not formally educated beyond the 7th grade, always said that you need to stand for something, stand up for something, and live well so someone will stand up for you. And of course, he said Tougaloo would be the best school to go to. He first was talking about Mr. Washington's school, Tuskegee, but my principal influenced me a lot to go to Tougaloo, and I loved it.
What was your major?
My major, English, a minor in history, a minor in library science.
Then after Tougaloo, what did you do?
I married. I married my present husband.
Did you meet him there in
No, he came to my hometown to practice medicine. And he was the first black doctor to come into Pascagoula. And I came home from college one summer and I met him. And he told me that when you graduate, little girl, I'll marry you. He thought he was kidding.
But you knew that.
I knew better.
You had your sights set.
Yes. And
Then-
I haven't regretted it.
Then after you finished at Tougaloo, did you go back then to Pascagoula?
No. He went to Korea and was there. I was in Pascagoula while he was in Korea for 10 months. And then when he came back from Korea, I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
Okay. And how long then was he in the military?
He was in the military until I asked him to retire. When the Korean campaign started, they needed physicians. They gave him 1 week to close his office, and another week he was in California, and in 3 weeks he was on the front lines at an aid station in North Korea. Well, that was not North Korea, South Korea. But he was there when the North Koreans came across the Yalu, came down. And then when he came back to the States, he came to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And that's where I joined him.
Well, while he was in Korea and
Then
you were
I was in
Pascagoula.
Pascagoula, and I taught school at Moss Point, Mississippi.
Okay, Moss Point. No,
You know that name?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Moss Point is to Pascagoula like Mountain Brook is to Birmingham. It's about 5 miles. And
Now, is Moss Point? That's not it's all black town?
oh no, it's not an all-black town.
But it is a,
But
it's
we
a
have
rather well off.
they have a black mayor now.
Okay. Then when? Yes, go ahead.
I met Reverend Nelson Smith because his father, Reverend Nelson Smith Sr., was the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Moss Point, Mississippi. That's how I met Nelson.
Okay. Well, is that why you came to Birmingham?
No.
Okay. Tell me
When
about-
my husband came back from Korea, when he got out of the Army at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, he came to Mobile, Alabama to practice medicine.
Okay.
We stayed there about a year because 5 physicians came in at one time. 3 were local boys, and 2 were from outside of Mobile, and I call it our starvation period. So after a year, he moved farther up to Bessemer, Alabama. And his office is still in Roosevelt City, and that's where I lived when we first came here. That was in 1953.
Did you teach in Mobile or in
No.
Oklahoma?
No, I was busy having babies.
Okay.
I had 2.
So then when you then came to Birmingham in '53, did you start teaching at that point?
I started teaching the next school session. And that's when I discovered that you had to have Alabama history before you could teach in the public school system. And I taught at Winona High School. But I came to Miles College to get Alabama history. And I was out here a summer. And that's where I met a lot of good people who influenced me. Myrtle Blissett, who is no longer here. And At that time, Dr. Bell was the president. And then, of course, I met Dr. Williams after him. But the person who most influenced my life was Dr. Lucius Pitts. I met Dr. Lucius Pitts. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's how I happened to get to Miles College.
Okay. So you taught at Winona and until...
I taught at Winona until my children became school age.
Okay.
And my husband and I both agreed that that's a full-time job.
And you were
to
living
be at
in
home.
Roosevelt at the time?
I was living in Roosevelt City.
Okay. It appears that
I moved to Birmingham in 1958. That's when I retired from teaching.
Teaching.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
I haven't taught since 1958.
That's all right. Well, we seem to have crossed paths at Winona. That was my first year at Winona.
Oh.
And, well, my first year was 57, so 57, 58 school year was my first year, and evidently that was your last year.
That's right.
So we did cross paths. So we both had good things in mind because we were from Winona. After Winona, then what did you do?
Well, that's when I became active in the community. Okay. We moved from Roosevelt City to Birmingham, where I live now. And it's the area called College Hills in Smithfield. And at that time, they were calling it Dynamite Hill. And I joined the Congregational Church there. My pastor was very active in the movement. I met my close and dear friend Deanie Drew, who lives around the corner from me. And the two of us, and there's another friend, Mrs. Montgomery, Althea Montgomery. We would come out to Miles, and Mr. Jonathan McPherson was working with the students at Miles. And at that time, the students there were not many students with cars. So what we did, we would provide cars, transportation for them. They blanket the community doing the selective buying campaign. We took the students to all of the communities in the Jefferson County area. And
let me back just a bit and ask you about getting involved. Your initial in 1958 was it 58 that you moved to College Hills?
58. Okay.
The movement, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, was organized in 1956. And they started with mass meetings at that time. Did you attend any of those meetings?
Went to mass meetings almost nightly. At that time, I had full-time help, and I had a line of babysitters. So during mass meetings, I never joined the Alabama Christian Movement, but every time Fred Shuttlesworth marched, I marched. They used to jokingly say, "Ruth, you got on your walking shoes." And that's where I met people like Georgia Price and Lola Hendricks. But Deanie would pick me up, or I would pick her up, and we would go to the mass meetings.
There were several events that took place, between the establishment of the movement, the Alabama Christian Movement in 56 and 1963. The first, issue that the movement dealt with was the issue of hiring a black police. One of the key issues, of course, was the integration of schools. In 57, when Reverend Shuttlesworth and his wife were attacked.
I remember that. Now, 57, I was teaching. You remember, if you were a school teacher, you could not even be a card-carrying member of the NAACP. And
why couldn't you be a card-carrying?
Well, they had outlawed the NAACP here in Alabama.
That's right.
And I had joined the NAACP in Mobile, Alabama. So I did not have to come to join. I was already a member. And someone told me, said, "Ruth, you shouldn't carry that card around." But I did. I'm getting off the subject now.
Well, that's a good piece of the story, because in '57, if you had a card, NAACP card in your pocket, and
you were subject to be fired from your job.
Was that simply something that was understood, or did someone tell you that?
Well, this is what. Well, you know, if you've taught, you hear rumors, and this is what was said, that you don't carry your NAACP card around with you. And I said, why? And of course, they said, well, Ruth, you know, they outlawed it. Well, anyway. Now, another organization, the Alabama Council on Human Relations, they met regularly at my church, the First Congregational Church.
Now, that's an interracial.
That's an interracial group. And I joined that, went to several of the meetings. I can recall coming outside of the church, and the policeman would be walking around the parking lot writing down the tags of the car, the numbers of the cars, tag numbers of the car.
Right.
And that was so they could keep up who was inside the church, what white people were there. And these people were automatically branded communists. And that's where I met Eileen Walbert.
The Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights meetings were actually attended by police officers.
Oh yeah, they put plainclothesmen would come in like they would at the mass meetings.
Did they do the same thing at the meetings at your congregational church?
I never knew if any of them came inside the church. They would be outside in the parking lot.
Simply taking
the tag number of the cars.
How did that affect attendance?
Well, these people had to be very brave because they always had a pretty large number of persons attending. Now, I had just moved up on the hill, didn't have as many babysitters, and so of course when I say babysitters, my children were school age, but I guess the word would be sitters. Didn't have too many of them, but when I lined up, some of the sitters when I first moved up there, Angela Davis was one of my sitters. Angela's sister Fania was one of my sitters. Her brother Benny was one of my sitters, and of course Janie Collins, whose sister Addie was killed at the 16th Street bombing, was one of my sitters. So I had a lot of people I could call on. This was in the early years. We haven't gotten to 63 because Angela was gone by that time.
Right. What was the makeup of that organization, the ratio between blacks and whites?
There were more whites than blacks.
Were most of the black people that were involved, were they your neighbors that live in College Hills?
The Drews, and no, some of them came from other parts of the city. I can't think of this lady's name, but I see her face right now.
Right. In 1960 was the year that the sit-in started, of course, in North Carolina, and then they really swept the entire South.
It started with students.
That's right.
That's when I came out. I was working with the Miles students.
How did that affect Miles College? Was Miles involved in that at all?
Well, Dr. Lucius Pitts invited Deanie, Drew, Althea Montgomery, and myself to come out and see if we could help the students because they did need transportation. And we became known as the Den Mothers of Miles College.
You mean he asked you to come out?
To come out, see whatever we could do to help. He didn't tell us to get involved, but he directed us to Dr. Jonathan McPherson. I think he's still on the faculty out here, I'm not sure. But anyway, these were the things that Dr. Jonathan McPherson told us they needed. They needed transportation. We would drive out here, pick up students, take them downtown, and they would try to sit in at Loveman's, Pizzitz, any place that had a lunch counter. Crest, Woolworths, Brits. Those were the 5 places.
So you are suggesting that was a concerted effort between the administration and the student body to demonstrate in downtown Birmingham?
Dr. Pitts was behind the students 100%. And the students of Miles worked diligently. Some were arrested. We would go to court with them. And that's when they started calling us Den Mothers of Miles. And of course, bail bond. Dr. Pitts said, you know, we are a Methodist school. We don't have any money for bail bond. But I don't remember any of the students having to stay overnight in jail. They went to jail. Now, this was before SCLC came into the city.
Right.
And then the students began to work with the Alabama Christian Movement. All of these things were going on at the same time.
Okay.
And that's when they blanket the community, asking the citizens to stay away from the stores. This is when the selective buying campaign started.
Before we get to selective buying, because that we're talking about 62 then, and that becomes a really big issue.
Oh, no, I don't
62.
remember these dates now. That's
why
okay.
I'll throw those out to you. But in 61, the Freedom Rides took place.
Oh, yeah, I remember when they came through and they were beaten up so terrible that, well, they were stopped in Anniston. And then when they got to the bus station here in Birmingham, they were met by people with baseball bats and chains, and it was terrible.
Right. There were individuals here who actually, I think some of them went to Anniston to pick up some of the riders. Shuttlesworth, of course, was called in. He was at the bus station, and some of the people went out to his church and out to his home. What do you remember about that particular episode? Maybe through newspapers or maybe through just discussions with individuals who were involved, people that you knew. Are there any recollections that you had about?
No, what I remember most about that, it was how brutal the white man was. And all these people were riding the bus, going through the South. And they had stopped this bus in Anniston. And some of the riders were taken from the bus and beaten. And then when they came into Birmingham, I remember reading, and I wasn't involved in this at all, but I do remember reading that there were blacks, and we were not called blacks then, we were called Negroes. There were Negroes who met them at the station also. And the whites were there, and there was a great confrontation.
Now,
the climate was not good at all. The climate was not good. It was a frightening situation.
in 62 then we get to the selective buying campaign. Can you tell me about the organization of that? How did that materialize?
Well, the students of Miles made leaflets, and we would take them to each community, and they would drop package of leaflets off at the churches in the community. They would also go from door to door, passing out leaflets, urging the people not to shop downtown. And I think it was very effective. Not nearly as effective as we wanted it to be, but no one could say they did not know a boycott was going on in Birmingham.
And you couldn't use the term boycott, right?
Now,
that was against the law.
Selective buying campaign.
Right. What initiated the selective buying campaign? Why? Why a selective buying campaign?
Well, there were certain things that the Alabama Christian Movement, Reverend Shuttlesworth, they had been asking for the past 6 or 7 years. And that was upgrading of black people who were already working at the stores, from hiring salespersons, training for the managerial position, desegregation of the lunch counters, simple, basic things. Desegregation of the toilets, desegregation of water fountains. These were the things that they were asking for. Nothing that...
Nothing really revolutionary.
That's right. Nothing really revolutionary.
The students, Miles College, was it correct that Miles College actually had a campaign, a fundraising campaign at the time? And I believe they were soliciting funds, and the city or someone.
They went from door to door as they did with the leaflets, with cups, and, asking for donations. And of course, I think that was relatively successful. Mm-hmm.
So then this is really when the movement, the Alabama Christian Movement and Miles College students
started working together.
Mm-hmm. Well, then we move into 1963.
Well,
of course,
that was when the SCLC came into the city at the invitation of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth of the Alabama Christian Movement. And of course, the city was going through its changes. We had a commissioner form of government at that time. 3 commissioners, Bull Connor, Jabba Wagner, and Art Haynes was the mayor. Well, we elected Albert Boutwell for mayor, and 9 council persons now. But anyway, they could not take their seat because Bull Carter and Art Haynes and Jabba Wagner would not move out.
Right.
But anyway, Reverend Shuttlesworth had invited SCLC to come into the city. And before it was known that SCLC was in the city, some of the personnel of SCLC had been in for 2 weeks, recruiting people to work. I didn't even know that they were in the city until the cry went out, "Come, we need your help." And since I was already out there working with the students, I went down.
You got involved.
I got involved with
this the beginning then of the mass meetings that would take place in April and May? This
was the beginning when SCLC came into the city. I went down when they asked for the citizens to please come. We need your support. I went down, and they wanted the citizens of Birmingham to be involved so that the white citizens could not justifiably say outside agitators. So they set up this committee. This committee, it was called the Central Committee. And I was elected secretary of the Central Committee. Now, the Central Committee was made up mostly of ministers, because these were persons who did not have to answer to the white man. He did not worry about losing his job. And then, of course, the black ministers could reach more black people than any other person in the community. So through the Alabama Christian Movement and SCLC, many black ministers showed up that day. And Deanie Drew and I were there. And I was elected secretary of that committee. And they met in room 30 every morning. Some days it would be in the afternoon. And
And you were at all of those meetings?
Sometimes I could not. It would depend on how long the lady that worked for me could stay. She came in the morning at 9 o'clock, and she stayed until 4. So I did not leave until she was there. And she did not leave until Denise and Tyree were home from school. Those are my children.
Right.
And by the time she left at 4 o'clock, I was back at home. And then when the mass meetings started, around 6 o'clock, I was gone again. But between 4 and sometimes 6 or 7, depending on another, we did homework and things like that.
Oh, so you did take the time to do the homework with
Oh,
the
we
kids?
had every night. We
Every
did
night,
homework.
and then you'd leave there, go
And
to
then
the mass meeting.
and go to the mass
Did your
meeting.
children ever go to the mass meeting?
No, my children never went to the mass meeting.
What?
My children went with me to Selma. My children went with me, with my husband and me, to Montgomery, and but not here in
to the
Birmingham.
mass meeting.
Not to the mass meetings.
Can you describe to me what a mass meeting was like?
The mass meeting was a combination of a revival, a political rally, nonpartisan that is, and a camp meeting. It was very fiery. You had a lot of singing of freedom songs, of spirituals. You had a lot of speech making, and you would always find the churches would be full every night. It did not start off that way, but it grew, and it got to the point where you could not get a seat. The churches would be full. They met at different churches: 16th Street Baptist Church, St. Paul, which is, I think, the next block from 16th Street, St. James, 6th Avenue Baptist. 6th Avenue Baptist was over where the medical center is now. Right. It was on 6th Avenue. I think
right
Mercy.
On the same corner.
That's right.
16th Street.
Uh-huh.
On the north side. In fact, I've heard someone say, I think it was Reverend Oliver, he said, 16th Street South.
16th Street, yes.
16th Street South. That
you know
good.
Reverend Oliver? He was a member of the Alabama Council on Human Relations. I think that's where I first met him.
Right. Yes.
And then he became a member of this Central Committee.
You participated very fervently during this April and May period, you being secretary.
Yes, but I did other things.
Okay.
We made placards. We picked up people at the airports. I ran roadblocks, I ran around roadblocks. That is, I would pick up demonstrators. Bull Connor would block off the streets, 5th Avenue, 19th Street, 4th Avenue. So we would go around down to 13th Street and go across to 3rd Avenue North, put the demonstrators out at 19th Street, and they would walk down to Pizitz, to Brits, to the, in. So I did more than just
So you were
write the
actually
minutes.
in the thick of things.
Yes, and then of course they made me chairman of the transportation committee. So what I did, I asked my friends who I knew were not working during that time, Dee Dee Drew and I, Althea Montgomery, Ruth Gaylord, Willa Adams. These were ladies who were at home. So we asked Red Bradford, we asked them to come, bring your cars. We need transportation. People were coming in from everywhere, and we had to pick them up and get them out.
Were you ever arrested?
No, but I had my toothbrush with me, and I carry my toothbrush with me to this day. You look over there in the pocketbook, you'll find a toothbrush.
Yeah. You're like the Boy Scouts. You're prepared.
I was prepared.
As you were so active, what did your husband say about your activity?
He encouraged me. He was paying for the gasoline for the cars. He was paying for the food or the placards or whatever. He went to his office every day, and then at night he would come home and he would help patrol our neighborhood. You see, we lived in, it was called Dynamite Hill at that time. and it was also a target for the KKK. And the men in the neighborhood would patrol that area because they were planting bombs at Arthur Shore's house and the Catholic Church down there. And when we went to Montgomery, he went to Montgomery with us. He went to Selma once. And when the march began from Selma to Montgomery, he was medical officer of the day. That is, he went down one afternoon, manned an aid station all that day and night, and came back the next day. Mm-hmm.
In Selma, one of the things that broke that movement was, well, not broke the movement, but assisted the movement, was the assistance of teachers. Teachers finally came out. Mm-hmm. Were there ever efforts here in Birmingham, those of you who had been teachers and had association with other teachers, to get others who were still in the classroom?
Well, if they were in the classroom, they could not very well. We were not asking anyone to jeopardize their jobs. Mm-hmm. But they supported in other ways. There were some who supported in other ways, financially. You know, they always needed money.
Sure.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
and of course, when the students of the schools came out, well, that was another situation where the teachers, they did not discourage the students not to go. And of course, we would drive to the campus of the schools, but we couldn't go on the campus to pick the kids up. That is, the children who lived way out north Birmingham. Reverend Bevel, Reverend Andrew Young, we called them Bevel and Andy at that time. They would tell us what schools, the kids were coming out, and they needed to be picked up. But some of these kids came out from schools a long distance away, and they walked to 16th Street Baptist Church. And the teachers did not discourage them, as far as we know. There was some, I understand, did, but very few.
Where were your children in school at the time?
At Wilkinson Elementary School. Mm-hmm.
Were kids from Wilkinson leaving school and getting involved?
I don't remember if any of them did. I really don't know. My children did not go. Mm-hmm. They were, there were kids as young as they were 9 and 10 at that time. Mm-hmm. Who did go to jail.
Yes. What church? I think you talked about this briefly, but what church were you a member of again?
The First Congregational Church.
And what was the level of its involvement?
Oh, very active. Reverend Harold Long, was the pastor of the Congregational Church at that time, and he was very involved. And I think, I'm not sure of this, but First Congregational was one of the few churches where interracial groups could meet. The Reverend Al Winger's church over on 6th Avenue South, the Lutheran church, they could meet there. But for some reason, I think they felt a little safer. I don't know, but they did meet at my church. And I understand Deanie said that St. Mark's opened their doors.
So the congregation then was in
support. So the congregation supported Reverend Long. And we have a very small congregation. And see, Arthur Shore's, the lawyer at that time for the movement, one of the lawyers, is a member of that church. And our present, the executive director of the Civil Rights Institute, Odessa Woolfall, is a member of that church.
You don't have a lot of rebels in that church. Tell me, are there any recollections that stand out in your memory during this period probably stands out more than any single incident that you remember?
Well, the day that the first time they turned the water hose on the children, when they came out of 16th Street Church there at Kelly Ingram Park. See, every time they marched, if they were going to march to the courthouse, we marched. If we could, we always end up at the back of the line, but we marched.
Who are we?
Deanie Drew and I.
Okay.
We marched with kids.
Okay.
And that day, we were at the back of the line when they came out of the church. And, to see the water hose, the pressure from the water hose turned on those young people. Well, they were young and old. It's heart-rending. It was terrible.
So when you see that on film today,
it brings
what
back
happens?
with fresh memories. It really does. Mm-hmm. I can also remember a time when we were marching over to the jailhouse and over on 6th Avenue South. And Bull Connor ordered the policeman. No, I get my marches mixed up sometimes. But we were marching, and Bull Connor ordered them to turn the water hose on. And that day, one fireman did not turn his on, and he had tears in his eyes. I remember that. Mm-hmm.
So that meant that you were pretty close to the front.
Sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes. Most of the time I was doing other things.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed people to do other things.
Tell me also about your activity, because I know that you were a member of the NAACP and you worked in voter registration campaigns with W.C. Patton. Can you tell me more
Yes.
about
Mr. Patton was asking for volunteers. I went down and we used the city directory to compile the voters list. We took the city directory and we wrote the names of every black male and black female listed.
But how did you know that who was black or not?
The city had already done the work for us. They coded the book behind the name of a white male, they had a 1. By the name of a white female, they had a 2. By the name of a black male, 3. By the name of a black female, 4. So all we had to do was just list the names that were numbered 3s and 4s. We wrote the names, addresses, telephone numbers, and then we compiled these voter lists by communities. And we would call, there were other people now, not just Deanie and myself, there were other persons helping. We would call these persons, ask them if they were registered voters, and if they said no, and 9 times out of 10 they would say no. We would tell them about the clinics that were being held to educate people to register and vote. Mm-hmm.
How successful were those
Well,
efforts?
it was very successful because black people wanted that opportunity to vote. And they would go to these clinics and they were taught how to register to vote.
Would this be in the 50s or the 60s?
Now this was early 60s.
Early 60s.
Now, in the 50s, let me go back just a minute.
Sure.
I was teaching at Winona High School. I lived in Roosevelt City. We had to go over to the community of Wilkes, which is across the highway from Valhalla, between Valhalla and Midfield. We had to go across to Wilkes to register to vote. They had questions, a long list of questions. They would ask questions like, who was the dog catcher in the Bessemer cutoff area? And, things like that. And I smuggled a list of the questions out took it to my class. I was teaching American history. I had it Xerox, took it to my class.
At Winona?
At Winona, and gave it to my students, and they took it home to their parents, and the parents studied them so they could pass the test to learn to vote. I mean, that is, to qualify, rather.
Sure. That's very interesting because we all know the kinds of questions that
They were
asked.
ridiculous.
And if you
didn't know,
absolutely.
so that's how some of my students' parents got the questions.
Tell me about your activity with the Urban League.
Well, at that time, there was a young man by the name of Clarence Wood that was here in Birmingham, and he was a Birmingham boy. And he invited me down to work with the Urban League. And of course, they had a different program that is training people. We knew that if the doors were opened, that the people were demonstrating to open, that you had to have qualified people to fill these jobs. So that was the role of the Urban League. And I helped in whatever way that I could. Don't remember all that, but I was secretary for a while. Then I stopped that too.
So you have volunteered. You've been really a professional volunteer. You've helped a lot of areas.
Absolutely nothing but
you-
work with my church.
You do what you want to do now.
Well, I'm a docent at the Civil Rights Institute.
Sure. All right. What is your assessment of the Birmingham movement? How successful? What were its accomplishments?
Well, I think that the Birmingham movement was a moral mirror for the rest of the country. I think that it was the catalyst, really, that the results was the 1964 Voting Rights Bill. It's true, the people in Selma, the crossing of the Pettus Bridge, they were instrumental and making Lyndon Johnson act on the Voting Rights Bill. But the Birmingham movement was the catalyst for all of those people. That's my opinion. I really think so.
Right. Birmingham precedes the 64 Public Accommodations Bill also.
That's
and
true.
Then it leads
That's
into
true. That's
the Voting
true.
Rights Bill.
That's what I mean when I say the moral mirror. And that's not my words. I picked that up from someone else. Some book I read, I don't know.
Okay. What do you think were the real issues?
Well, in the beginning, the real issues, we were just asking for basic necessities, things that were, that you would expect any citizen to want. The right to sit and eat, the right to relieve yourself, public accommodations, the right to go to whatever school you want to go to. And these were the things that happened, and only those persons who had the money or the education could really take advantage of these things. And
But if you were black, even if you had the money and education.
that's right. Here in Birmingham, we didn't have those opportunities.
Well, are there any other things that we have not touched upon that you would just like to mention?
I can't
know
think
that
of a thing.
you've talked an awful lot about a lot of things. And what we will normally do is to look at this, and we possibly will have a follow-up at some point, because I know that in an hour's time, we're really, I think it evokes and it stirs up some of your memories. But I'm sure when you get home, you're gonna remember some other things, and then we will possibly want to do this again. But I want to thank you for coming out taking your time from your busy schedule and sitting with us today.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much.
Sweet in the morning. Oh Lord, it's sweet.